Hello again. You know, it's very difficult for human beings to know what God is really like. I mean, some people think it's obvious, for example, that God is mean and angry and vengeful, while other people take it as a given that God is loving and kind and saves everyone. These people, what's so funny about this is that they're getting their different opinions about God from the exact same source, the Bible itself. Because for every Bible verse that says God is love, there's another verse that says God called down 2 she-bears to maul a bunch of street toughs. See, I think what happens is it's so hard for human beings to understand God because there is so much about who he is and his nature that it's hard for us to distill it down into something that's manageable for us to relate to. See, this is something that I call the reality TV paradox. See, if you don't know how reality TV works, they film hundreds of hours of footage, but then they have to distill all of that footage down into 44 minutes of actual airtime, and even less for the different people involved. And so what happens, if you didn't know this about reality TV, that the producers, the editors, they can decide whether they want to cast a particular contestant as a hero or as a villain. And then by selectively picking whichever clips they want, they can show only the best versions of that person, the times when they had plenty of sleep or they won a challenge, or they can show all of the worst clips of that person. And whichever ones they selectively choose to show you on your TV screen is gonna dictate how you react to that person. And that exact same thing goes on for God. God has a reality TV paradox, which is he is so huge, he is so transcendent, so much bigger than any human being could ever possibly know in a lifetime, because he is infinite and we are finite mortal beings. And so as a result, we can selectively choose which parts of the Bible, which descriptions of God we think are the most important. And then we build our own story. We write a story that helps us make sense of God and the world based on our selective choosing of those different passages. And so that's where you can have an enlightened atheist look at the Bible and say, I could never believe in a God who condones and even commands genocide. But you could also, on the other side, have a fundamentalist, Bible-beating kind of a person say, I can't believe that God or the Bible would be R-rated. And they are R-rated, if you didn't know that. We can have a whole conversation about the swear words that have been conveniently left out of the English translations of the Bible. But the point is this, that we all do it. You, me, everyone else. We try to piece together our own coherent image of God, and yet every one of us is selectively choosing some things and ignoring or minimalizing some of the other things that don't fit into our story as well. So for example, we talk a lot about the attributes of God, and you will hear lots of sermons about the power of God, or how God has love, or how God's full of wisdom. But there is an attribute of God that I think gets left on the editing floor a lot of times. It's an attribute that is just as much of his nature as power and love and wisdom, and yet you don't hear a lot of people talking about it. And it's one of the things I want to talk about today. That one of the attributes of God is this: our God has a wicked sense of humor. He is just full of delight and comedy, and we don't always think of it that way. You don't necessarily look at the Bible and read humor in it. But again, if you actually look at some of the different passages, you look at some of the ways God describes himself and reveals himself to us, he's got a pretty good sense of humor. I mean, just look at creation, right? God didn't have to make a giraffe. Right? I mean, that didn't have to be a thing. He could have made trees lower to the ground, or even having made trees, he could have just given everything wings so it could fly up there, or made everything like a monkey so it could climb up there. But instead, God said, hey, guys, I got this idea. I'm gonna take a deer and I'm gonna stretch his neck out really long so he can reach the leaves at the top of the trees. Like, this is a sign of God's humor, his sense of delight in creation, that he made things not because of some utilitarian goal, survival of the fittest. He made things because he delighted in them. And we get a glimpse at God's sense of humor in some of the very odd things that he made. For example, have you ever heard of a sea cucumber? This is a very odd creature. Check this video out.
In the animal kingdom, there's no emergency rooms, band-aids, or kisses from mommy. Fighting takes guts. For this cuke, that's no metaphor. A fish nips at its backside, the wrong side. it expels its guts out of its very own ring of fire. Their filaments are sticky and toxic. If the fish gets caught, it might die. The fish wants no part of this fight, or this surprisingly resourceful lump.
Isn't that just bonkers? I mean, that is one of the weirdest creatures you've ever heard of, right? And it just goes to show that the emptiness of evolution can't really explain something like that, because survival of the fittest doesn't need that weird of a defense mechanism. There are easier ways to protect yourselves from other creatures. And yet when I see something like that, when I see a sea cucumber and that just bizarre way that it defends itself, I just get a glimpse of this humor that God has, this delight that he has in just doing silly and ridiculous and wonderful things with the world. And that's not just my spin. God himself talks that way. In fact, he got into kind of a heated theological discussion with a guy named Job once. And as God is making his side of the case, he calls out to Job. He says, look, Job, look at all the things I made. I'm so much bigger and stronger and wiser than you are. I made horses and hawks and behemoth and leviathan. I made all these things. And then there's this one really random tangent that God goes off on in the middle of a theological debate with Job. God says, look, I made hawks, I made horses, I made all these things. And have you seen that ostrich? I made that. The wings of the ostrich, they flap joyfully, even though they cannot compare with the wings and feathers of the stork. They can't fly. And the ostrich, she lays her eggs on the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them and that some wild animal may trample them. For God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at horse and rider. As God's making a case about both theology and philosophy, but it's also as he's revealing himself to Job, he doesn't only reveal his power and his wisdom and his creative abilities, he also just takes this moment to just sheerly delight in this ridiculous bird that he made. He's like, guys, I made this bird and it's got big wings, can't fly, but it can run really fast. It puts the horse to shame. And that God himself is delighted in this thing that he made. It's yet one more sign of this sense of humor that God has. But God's humor, it's not just delight and silliness, although we see those things too. Sometimes God's humor gets a little dark. In fact, one of the earliest recorded roasts comes from God. You might not have known this story. There was a particularly bad king named Jehoram. He was pretty bad. He murdered his brothers so that they couldn't challenge him for the throne. He had all sorts of idol worship, and he did all these terrible stuff. And so God struck him down dead. And then this is how God records the death of Jehoram. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 8 years. And then he passed away at 40 to no one's regret and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Only the good kings got in that tomb. I mean, this is God just roasting Jehoram for all posterity, just saying, oh, and by the way, he died. No one even regretted it once he died. And we see that God has this kind of dark, ironic sense of humor. We see it all throughout. We see it in the way that he brings consequences to people. Like when he reveals an angel to Zechariah and promises to do a miracle, and Zechariah is kind of talking too much about his doubts and fears and questioning. And God just says, okay, fine. You know what? You don't get to talk anymore until your baby is born. It's very ironic punishment. Or when Jesus was walking the earth and he said to his disciples, things like, hey, if you want to live by the sword, that's fine. You're going to die by the sword. It's a very ironic truth that Jesus brought to people. And I bring all of this up about the nature and attributes of God because we, right now, you and I, we are living in a very ironic time. If you don't believe me, just look at all of the politicians that are doing things that don't match what they said about a month ago before the coronavirus hit. It's a very ironic time. And I think one of the most ironic features for our culture today is that we who are in a culture that prides itself on busyness, on our productivity, on our GDP, we are now forcibly at home, social distancing and quarantining. It's very ironic that we've been forced to slow down in our lives. And I think it's ironic, and maybe even more than that, I think it's just fitting and appropriate that right here in this time that we find ourselves in, where we're forced to slow down, forced to rest, we already have had it slated for a long time that we're going to be talking today about Sabbath, about this intentional rest that God calls us to have in our lives. Now, we're going to be looking mostly in Mark, but before we get there, I want to start with the way God introduced Sabbath to us, which is as part of the 10 Commandments. When God was first putting his people together, he'd rescued them from Egypt and saying, here's the kind of way I want you to live. And he said, here are the 10 most important things. One of the 10 was this idea of a Sabbath. And what's interesting is it's probably one of the ones that we've been quickest to discard and get rid of. We still think it's probably wrong to kill people. It's probably wrong to lie. But Sabbath is not one that's really bothered too many people by ignoring it, especially when we have a nice bottom line to show for it. And yet, we did get it in the midst of the 10 Commandments. It's something that God himself gave us from the beginning of his creation of a civilization of his people. This is what God says. He says, all right, so remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. I mean, there it is. It's pretty clear, and he even tries to point out that there's not really a lot of loopholes here. Like your animals have to keep the Sabbath; they can't keep working. And even foreigners, which I think is so interesting, is to let foreign people among you, people who don't share in your faith, let them have a day of rest as well. That's how important this is. It's not even just for my people; it's for anyone that's in a culture of my people. We need to let them have Sabbath and rest. And you have likely heard of this law, this idea, this concept of a Sabbath. But if you have, you've probably heard of it in this idea of a legalistic deprivation of normal life. You're not allowed to do normal things on the Sabbath. You can't work, you can't turn on light switches, you can't watch TV. Like, there's all these things you're not supposed to do on a Sabbath. Or in more Christian circles, you'll tend to hear things like, oh, you shouldn't work at all on the Sabbath, but what you should do is you should just go to church. Even if you don't like church, even if it's an obligation, just go because it's what you're supposed to do. It's how you honor the Sabbath. And we have taken this thing that God gave us for reasons that we're going to unpack a little later, but we've taken it and we've made it a very empty, legalistic, ritualized observance. It's not something that anyone does out of joy or pleasure. It's something that we do just because, well, I guess we're supposed to. And more often than not, when we're not working, we feel like we should be working. Or when we are at home, we feel like we should be doing something different. It's not been a time that's filled with anything meaningful. It's just become an empty vacating of the work that we should be doing. And so maybe we take a nap, or we watch some football, or we get all the chores caught up on the weekend and get ready for the week ahead. But I think we've lost the intent that God had when he gave us the Sabbath in the first place. Dan B. Allender describes the way that we tend to perform the Sabbath these days like this. He says, many who take the Sabbath seriously and intentionally ruin it with legislation and worrisome fences that protect the Sabbath but destroy its intended delight. For many Sabbath keepers, it is a day of duty, diligence, and a spiritual focus that eschews play and pleasure, can't have those, instead avoids them for the sake of Bible reading, prayer, naps, and tedious religious services that seem designed to suck the air out of the soul. If that is keeping the Sabbath holy, then it's better to break it. The darker option is to ignore it, or perhaps even worse, to think that one is keeping it simply by going to church. Pretty strong words, but also really healing words for me to hear at a time where it's literally impossible to go to church anymore or anywhere that we were supposed to be going in our regular daily routine of our lives. But if this was not what Sabbath was meant to be, if this kind of legalistic rule following, getting rid of play and pleasure for the sake of fulfilling a religious obligation, if this is not the point, if this is actually breaking the Sabbath just as badly as ignoring it, then what is the Sabbath supposed to be? How are we supposed to approach it instead? While we're stuck at home on the couch contemplating our lives, how can we contemplate the Sabbath in a different way and use it the way God intended us to? Well, here's where Jesus comes into the picture. And as he was talking with his disciples and living a life that was very countercultural, very baffling to even the religious leaders of the day, we see how the very intentional choices he was making were meant to challenge some assumptions and legalisms that we had fallen into and to help point us back to the original intent of what God meant for the Sabbath. So let's look at what Jesus did in Mark. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" See, here's the thing about Jesus. When he came to earth, it was with the intent of redeeming everything. Not just our sin or the death that we all had facing us, but that Jesus was redeeming even the law of God, this thing that we had lost track of its original intent, and we're now legalistically and in fact damagingly trying to fulfill it. And Jesus came through and with one sentence, he completely overturned the Sabbath, flipped the laws of God on their head. The Sabbath is made to serve human beings, not humans made to serve the requirements, the legalisms of the Sabbath. It was meant to bless and help us. In fact, the Sabbath command, like all of the commands of God, the ones we've been talking about in this very series, these lost ways, all of them, even though they are commands of God, they're not commands of obligation, as Dion Garrett said last week, but every single one of them is an invitation into a way of life that is fuller and better. The Sabbath was intended to meet our needs. And so when God says, "I want you to keep the Sabbath," it wasn't so that he could feel special up in heaven. It was because there was something that we need that we can only find when we observe the Sabbath in our lives. So what is that? What could that possibly be? Well, let's go back to Exodus chapter 20, and I want you to look again at what it connects Sabbath to. See, all of the other laws, it just kind of says them in a vacuum. It just says, hey, you shouldn't have other gods. You shouldn't misuse the name of the Lord your God in vain. You should honor your father and mother. It just kind of says you should just do these things. This is the only commandment where God actually explains a little bit of why we should keep it. He says this, "Because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day." Sabbath is connected to God's creation. There's something about the fact that he spent 6 days working on making everything that we see, but on the seventh day, he rested. Now, I think we tend to see that word rest and we understand it through our own human lens. And so we think, well, when I'm resting, it's because I'm tired. I've physically exerted myself, and now I need a break. I need a rest. I need a nap. And so we tend to project that onto God, but this is where we get back into the attributes of God again. God doesn't need to rest in a physical way. It's not like God, got done, putting the sun up in heaven. Like, that was a lot of exertion for my muscles. I need a nap. When God's talking about resting, he's talking about something that's different than what I think we assume. You see, God's saying that he's contrasting two things. He's saying for 6 days, he worked. And then on the seventh day, he rested. And so there is something about the nature of God's rest that is contrasted with the work that's been done. And so here's what I would propose to you this morning. That the opposite of work is not inaction, but the opposite of work is play. See, just like you wouldn't, what's the biggest Lego set? Hogwarts has a really big Lego has a really big Hogwarts set. It takes, on estimate, 20 hours to assemble the entire Hogwarts castle. And there's this moment where you after you've put in 20 hours and you finish the castle and it looks amazing, what do you do next? You play with it. That's why you built a Lego set, was so that you could recreate some moments from the movies or the books, and you could have the characters go through all of these things that you've read and seen, and you can play with the Lego set. If you spend 20 hours building a Lego set and then you put it up on a shelf and ignore it forever, like you've missed the point. So the opposite of God's work that he's trying to get us to understand through the Sabbath is that the opposite of work is not inactivity. The opposite of work is play. And in fact, the Sabbath is God's invitation for you and me to play with him. That's what's going on. When he finished making the world and it was all so good, everything was good and very good, and then God steps back like an artist who's just finished a painting and just admires what he did for a day. See, what God's doing with Sabbath, what he's doing with his resting, is he's admiring what he did. He's delighting in this thing he made. He's delighting in you and in me. And so when he then encourages us, he says, hey, just like I spent 6 days making everything and then a seventh day delighting in the work I did, I'm now inviting you, my covenant people, you, the children that I created, you, the people I died for. I'm inviting you to delight with me for one whole day every week. This is the picture of Sabbath. It's an opportunity to play with God. And when we think of it merely as an inactivity, as a stopping all of the work and the productive things that we're supposed to be doing, we miss out on the delight and the joy that God wants us to have in the face of the Sabbath. See, with the Sabbath, God is inviting us to share in the divine delight that he felt at creation. But all too often, we end up settling for human distractions instead. You see, I think distraction's a lot easier. It sure is for me. And there's been something about being forced to be at home more often and to know that all of the places that I would normally take my kids, because they're not allowed to be in school right now, I would normally do all of these things to distract ourselves during the day. I'd take them to Chick-fil-A and they could play in the playground, or we'd go to a museum or a zoo or a playground, and I can't do any of those things. I can't just distract ourselves. But what I would maintain and what I've been learning in a very hard way the last couple of weeks myself is that it's actually been a blessing from God that we're forced to be at home and that so many of the distractions that we've normally relied on have been taken away from us. Because it's God giving us an opportunity to say, hey, now that the distractions are gone, maybe, just maybe, you can start to delight in the life that I've given you. Not just try to while away the minutes or count down the days until we can get our kids back to school somehow, but to actually enjoy the moments that we have with our family, with ourselves, with God. You see, this delight picture that God invites us to have is so much bigger, is so much more joyful and more fulfilling than the distractions that we so often settle for. Because I think at the end of the day, we're all a little uncomfortable with true delight. It's a little too big of a feeling. It's too hard to strive for, and it's too fleeting once you have grasped it. You might taste it for a little bit, but then it's gone for the moment. And so our unsettling relationship with delight lets us decide instead to settle for just simple diversions, simple distractions. In fact, I think that's why the vacations that we take are also often not as fulfilling as we'd like them to be. Because if you even think of it, the word vacation comes from the word vacate, to empty. And all we're doing so often with vacations, I think most of the time at least, is we're just emptying ourselves from the stresses of work and the things that we're doing. And so we go somewhere else hoping that if we can just empty the day-to-day routine, if we can not have all of the work piling up on our plate, if we can just go somewhere else, then that will be joyful. And also, all too often it isn't. Because it's not enough to just empty yourself of work. It's not enough just to be intentional about inactivity. We have to seek and strive for delight. But that's a really difficult and hard thing to do. In fact, it's a little intimidating, a little scary. And yet, if we don't strive for that, I don't know that we'll ever understand the joy that God intended for us when he gave us the Sabbath in the first place. If we're not willing to pause, to take advantage of this national situation that we find ourselves in, and to ask ourselves, what delight is God finding in me today? And what delight is he inviting me to seek out and to search for in this time? Here's a question that Dan B. Allender, the guy that wrote a book on Sabbath, it's a question he asks his students. He encourages people to ask themselves, what would I do for a single 24-hour period of time if the only criterion was to pursue my deepest joy? What he finds when he asks that question of his students is most of them get really angry by that question. It doesn't sound freeing or joyful to even think about their own joy. They feel, it makes them feel uncomfortable, unsettled, stressed. And I don't know about his students, but I'll certainly say this, it makes me feel all those things as well. I can't even fathom what it'd be like to just stop and say, what would bring me deepest joy? But what else are we gonna do right now? What if we did just stop and ask ourselves, ask our families this question? What is it in my life? What is something I could do that would bring me deepest joy? And really push through. Don't just settle for, oh, we go to Disneyland. No one's going to Disneyland right now. But look for what is the thing that would make you feel like your life was meaningful and fun? What's that thing that you don't have time to do because you're so busy in the grind, you're so busy trying to pay rent and keep food on the table and keep up with the demands of work and relationships? What's that thing that would just bring you nothing but fun and pleasure and delight to do? And I think there are a lot of options. But as you start to think about what it might be for you, notice that that very question is going to require a lot of work, a lot of preparation for you. If you're someone that would love nothing more than to go fishing and spend 24 hours just out on a lake fishing, well, you got to plan for that. You've got to rent the boat or buy the boat. You've got to get all the right equipment. You've got to research what that lake is and what's biting in that place. For you to have delight, counterintuitively, takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I think right there is the crux of what God is inviting us to consider today. That Sabbath doesn't mean inactivity. It doesn't mean just pure relaxation in a hammock. But it means putting your effort 6 days of the week into something that the seventh day of the week you will be able to experience joy and pleasure and the fullness of delight. Not just distraction, not just soothing yourself with Netflix binging or video games or scrolling through endless news feeds, but 24 hours of something that would really fulfill both your sense of self, your relationships with others. That's the purpose and the calling of Sabbath. That's the kind of play that God's inviting us to engage in with him. And as I was wrestling with this week, there's a distinction that stuck out, that rang true to me. That the difference between empty distraction, mere human diversions, and true divine play with God comes down to this idea of risk. Play is risky. Living in the thrill of life is scary. And so if something that you're doing, whether it's with your weekends or your time off or whatever, if it's safe and easy, there's a chance that it's just something you're doing to soothe and numb yourself. There's a chance it's just a distraction from the delight and the joy that God would have you find in this life and in the next. But if what you're doing is actually risky, if there's a thrill there, if there's a way that it could go wrong or it could be dangerous, maybe then you're tapping into that kind of play that God would have us do. This is why I think sports are so compelling and why I still love playing sports, because when you go play a basketball game, there's a chance you might lose. There's a chance you might get hurt. You might look foolish if you go for a layup and you miss it. And now we're starting to tap into what makes play so thrilling and so delightful. It's because the risk of something that could go wrong, something that could hurt, that actually is the thing that means that you're living life fully. And by that definition, there are even things that we might be tempted to define as work, but they're not. Maybe starting up that new business right now or that side hustle that you've always wanted to put more time into because it brings you joy. Maybe the risk of that would be a way to enter into play and delight with God right now. Because if there's anything that's not safe, it's trying to start a business right now. And yet, if you have found something that brings you pleasure, that brings you joy, and there's a way that you could lean into that more fully, knowing that that's a risky proposition, you've started to take a step into playing with God. And again, there's something about God's sense of humor in all of this. The fact that he was the kind of God who could delight in creating such a varied and odd, weird world with creatures all across the spectrum, that then when he gives us the Sabbath, he connects it so clearly to creation. He says, no, it's getting out in the world is actually the way that you're gonna understand and feel and sample and taste Sabbath the way I want you to have it. See, creation is the means God gives us to bask in awe of what he's really like. But when we're trying to figure out who is this God and what are his intentions towards me, one of the clues we get is that he's made a delightful world, but it's also a little dangerous, a little risky, a little scary. And one of the ways that we begin to engage in a Sabbath mindset, a mindset of delight and play and joy with a little bit of danger, a little bit of thrill, is by looking at this playground that God has given us, looking at the creation and everything in it and letting it thrill and delight and maybe even scare us a little bit. That's how we start to find Sabbath. See, this is the point, that you can't have thrill without danger, that you can't experience true joy and delight without the risks that come with it. And we ourselves cannot experience Sabbath the way God would have us do it unless we're willing to let life be a little risky, a little scary for ourselves. Think of it this way. A lot has been written and talked about how Chick-fil-A is always closed on Sundays. But notice that that's not primarily, I don't think, because of a legalistic, oh, God says you can't work on Sunday. God actually doesn't quite say that. But think of the risk involved in someone trying to start a fast food company, knowing that every other chain out there operates and earns income 7 days a week. And for you to say, actually, hang on, we're gonna honor the Sabbath, the spirit of the Sabbath, the risk and the delight of the Sabbath that says, you know what, we won't be open that one day because we are gonna delight in God on the Sabbath. And we're gonna let that risk play out and see what happens. And what you've seen or maybe have noticed is that this is now a fast food company that makes more money on 6 days than all the other fast food companies make in 7. And it's that kind of risk that I think God is inviting you and me to join him in right now. That as we're forced to live lives that were not what we would have chosen for ourselves, can we risk something bigger? Can we aim for a delight that's so much better than distraction, knowing that that journey is so much scarier than just settling for the empty diversions of life? And if you're willing to honor that call that God's putting in front of you, then here are some suggestions for you. Maybe right now, let's use this creation that God gave us and let it spark awe and delight in you. Let's find our delight again. And since it's sometimes so hard to find it in ourselves, let's find it in the creation God gave us. You can still go for walks. You maybe have to stay 6 feet away from people, but you can get out there and you can see the nature and the creation that is around you. Or if you can't, there are lots of magnificent Earth documentaries that are streaming right now. Watch them and just bask in this sense of who God is, the wonder that he instills in us through the variety of his creation. Or maybe there's an opportunity right now for you to seek joy in your deep connections with others. See, I think this is why going to church is a part of the Sabbath. Not as a legalistic thing you have to do to please God, but because that's the place where you can connect with God and connect with others in deeper ways than the other 6 days of the week offer you. And so even right now, as you're stuck at home, you can still be finding ways to connect with other people. You're live streaming right now, you're watching us, but maybe even invite another family or two. Keep it small, keep your social circles limited, but in this moment where we can't meet in large groups, continue to meet in small groups. Worship God together and find opportunities to connect with people in a way that you might never have connected with that person because you just didn't have time with the pace and the hurriedness of life today. Or maybe enter into that risky, thrilling play of God by desiring something riskier and richer for yourself. Maybe this is the opportunity to take stock of your life and the trajectory that it's on. The work that you've been doing for so long that now maybe you can't do or you can only do in a more limited sense. And to use this Sabbath season to reflect on those priorities and to think to yourself, what do I actually want to be doing with my life? What would bring me delight and joy? And it should be a little scary to think about that. If it is, that's how you know you're on the right track. But right now in this season, as we are truly living in an unprecedented time of forced Sabbath rest for our entire nation, we can go into that kicking and screaming. We can fight it and resist it and complain about our leaders. I've done some of that myself the last few weeks. Or we can lean into this moment and take it as the ironic gift that it is from God, an opportunity to reevaluate ourselves and our priorities, to focus on the things that would truly bring us delight, and to reorient our actions towards those goals. Let's pray together. Lord God, I give you thanks that you designed all of your commandments for our good, for our joy. And right here now, Lord, as I know that I'm stressed and frustrated, trying to figure out how to get life back to normal or as close to normal as I can. Lord, I'm so grateful that you have diverted my thinking, that you've placed this Sabbath front and center in our lives, and that you're giving us an opportunity to reconsider priorities, not out of the things that we have to do or that we should be doing different or better, but that you've given every one of us an opportunity to think about what truly would bring us delight in this world. What is the thing that we could spend 6 days a week laboring over so that the seventh day we could delight in what we had done with you? So Lord, I pray right now that your Holy Spirit would be on the hearts of all who are listening, that you would help shine the light in their heart of that thing that you created them to do and be. That one thing that would bring them joy in who you made them to be, that they would find it, that they would pursue it, and that you would enter into that thing with us, playing with us, and letting our delight be a delight that you share in as well. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.